So let's talk about the rules. So whenever in class you're learning about the rules, you're paying close attention to what the professor says about the rules because you want to identify the rules exactly how your professor identifies them. So making sure that your rules are not truncated in any way, they're not incomplete, or you try to shorten them, but rather they are the exact wording that your professor wants you to use. So let's talk more about the rules. So remember that rules give guidance to the court or to the jury about how to reach a legal conclusion. So sometimes the rules are pretty self-explanatory. You can find a definition, like what is negligence, or you can find it in a statute. The elements for battery are, or you have to synthesize a rule. So sometimes once you read a line of cases, you have to see the pattern and come up with a rule that is synthesized from those cases. So therefore, you're looking at what do courts require in order to find a legal consequence. So here, my normal formula is when you have certain sets of facts, a court will find a legal conclusion. So for example, the legal consequence here is to support a cause of action for battery, the plaintiff must prove that defendant intended to cause harmful or offensive bodily conduct, which is the required circumstance. Or you can switch it around. So when defendant reasonably believes that a plaintiff is about to use or imminently use unlawful physical force, the required circumstance here, the defendant may use a degree of force he reasonably believes necessary to defend himself, i.e. the self-defense doctrine. So I hope that helps in terms of how you think about rules. But basically, the rules will give you those little breadcrumbs to come to that conclusion. So when you have a rule that doesn't make quite sense, or there's unknowns within the rules, you want to continue to break it down, which I'll show you in a second. Okay, so in our case, from the restatement, I've gathered this rule about intrusion upon seclusion. So the general rule, meaning the three elements that we need to prove or to support a cause of action for intrusion upon seclusion is that 1, the plaintiff must prove that defendant intentionally intruded, 2, into plaintiff's solitude or seclusion or into a private matter, and 3, in a manner that's highly offensive to a reasonable person. So remember, when you are stating the rules for an exam, you want to be specific and follow the exact language that your professor has discussed the rules. So instead of shortening them, or instead of having incomplete rule statements, you want to make sure that the rule statements are clear and they are exactly the way that your professor has talked about the rule. Okay, so in the slide before, I had the general rule for intrusion upon seclusion and the 3 elements that are required to prove it. But, what does into plaintiff solitude or seclusion or private matter mean? So to give clarity to the court and to the jury, you want to make sure that you're breaking it down into something that's going to help explain what that means. How do you get to proving that element? So here I have whether a defendant intruded into a place of plaintiff's solitude or seclusion or a private matter depends on if plaintiff had a reasonable expectation of privacy. And again, reasonable expectation of privacy is also not that clear, so I want to break it down even further. So my next subrule is going to be reasonable expectation of privacy requires both a subjective and an objective expectation of privacy. So I hope that helps in terms of breaking down the rules to the point where you can help the reader or the court or the jury come to the same conclusion that you are figuring out the required circumstances to reach a legal consequence. Okay, so now let's talk about analysis. So remember that the analysis requires you to apply the rule to the set of facts that's given to you in the fact pattern. So here, remember the rules include definitions, the common law, statutes, synthesized rules or subrules that you have identified. And then in the purple, we're going to identify the facts. So to remember, to have a complete analysis, you need to have both the rules and the facts. So oftentimes, you might see a comment from your professor that says too conclusory. So what does too conclusory mean? So here, I've given a sample of what is too legally conclusive. Here, defendant intruded into plaintiff's place of solitude or seclusion because plaintiff had a reasonable expectation of privacy at the restaurant. Expectation of privacy with both subjectively and objectively reasonable, thus this element is satisfied. So do you see how all of this are just a bunch of rules strung together? And there is no rule application of any facts that are given in the fact pattern. So in that sense, it's too legally conclusive because you are just repeating back the rules in order to get to the conclusion. All we're doing is lining up a bunch of facts that we pulled from the from the question and lining it all together. So here, there is no rule, there aren't any rules. Instead, I'm just stringing a bunch of facts and hoping that the professor can understand how I reach my conclusion that the plaintiff had a reasonable expectation of privacy by just laying out all the facts. So now let's look at an answer that would tie both the rules and the facts together. So here, defendant intrude into plaintiff's place of solitude or seclusion because plaintiff and B were sitting in the back of the restaurant in a private booth and whispering to each other. Plaintiff likely had a subjective expectation that their conversation was private. Defendant could argue that because the restaurant is a public place where conversations are easily overheard, her expectation was not objectively reasonable. However, defendant had to play the recording back on full volume to hear plaintiff say the mayor is a crook. Because this is different than simply overhearing someone's conversation with unaided ears, it's objectively reasonable for plaintiff to believe that whispering in B's ear would keep the information private. Thus, a court would likely find that P's expectation of privacy was both subjectively and objectively reasonable. So here, notice that I am interlacing the rules with the facts in purple, yellow rules, purple facts, and my keyword to connect those two is going to be because. So in every sentence of my analysis, if I can, I will try to use because in all of my sentences so that I am making sure that I'm making a conscious effort to connect rule, yellow, to facts, purple. Okay, so here's this final slide of why legally conclusive is only relying on yellow, and then to factually conclusive is just laying out all the facts without connecting it to the rules. And then the final column, which would give a better answer, is to connect the rules and the facts, get rules yellow, purple facts, with the word because to make your answer complete.